On a July afternoon in 1981, a 6-year-old boy stands 3 kids deep in line for a video game inside a Sears department store. His mother tells him she's stepping over to the lamp section just a few aisles away. He says okay. He doesn't look up again. 10 minutes later, she comes back. The line is gone. The boy is gone. Every kid who'd been standing there is gone. Here's what almost nobody outside that store would learn for the next 27 years. A store employee had already pulled that same boy aside minutes earlier, sent him out an exit door he'd never used, into a parking lot he didn't recognize. And the company that employed her chose, deliberately, to never tell his parents. Not that day, not for decades. 2 weeks later, 2 fishermen casting lines in a drainage canal 120 miles north see something floating in the water. It isn't what they think it is. This case would eventually get a press conference, an apology, and the word closed attached to it. What it never got was a trial. No jury ever heard this case. No one was ever convicted. And the single piece of evidence that could have settled it for good sat forgotten in a storage unit for 25 years until it was finally too late to matter. Where are you watching this from? Drop it below and hit subscribe and like, because what happened to Adam Walsh didn't just become one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. It rewrote how this country searches for missing children altogether. Let's go back and slow this story down, because almost everything that made this case what it became happened inside gaps. Gaps in information, gaps in response time, gaps that nobody filled until it was already too late to matter. Adam John Walsh was born November 14, 1974. By 6 years old, he stood 3.5 feet tall and was, by every account from people who knew him, proud of every inch of it. Sandy blonde hair, hazel eyes, a face covered enough in freckles that his own father used to joke that if you could order a son out of a catalog, Adam would be the one that arrived. He loved baseball. He loved drawing. He watched Sesame Street on Saturday mornings. And he was shy, not the kind of shyness kids perform for attention, but the real, quiet kind, where he needed a moment before he trusted someone new. That detail sat in the background of an otherwise ordinary childhood. Nobody had any reason to think it would matter. It would end up mattering more than anyone could have guessed. His father, John Walsh, was riding the momentum of a $26 million hotel project in Miami, working as vice president of marketing, a man who'd built a career out of nothing and was still climbing. His mother, Reve, was a part-time student and a competitive bodybuilder, someone actively shaping her own identity alongside being a wife and a mother. Their home in Hollywood, Florida, looked from the outside like exactly what people picture when they picture the American dream working out. A nice house, a real career, a marriage, and at the center of all of it, their only child. July 27, 1981, began like an unremarkable Tuesday. That morning, a family friend named James Campbell, everyone called him Dudley, stopped by the Walsh home, the way he often did. He'd lived with the family off and on for years, close enough to the household that Reve asked if he could take Adam along with him to work that day. He said no, too windy for the boats he'd be dealing with, and left around 10 to prep for a commercial shoot. By 11 that morning, Reve had Adam in the car, running 2 errands. First stop, a Lutheran school, to drop off a check registering Adam for 2nd grade. Second stop, the Hollywood Mall, where a Sears store had a lamp Reve had been watching for months, waiting for it to go on sale. She had the newspaper ad in her hand. Today was finally the day. They parked on the north side of the building, her usual spot, and walked in through the north entrance. On the way toward the lamp section, they passed through the toy department, where a brand new Atari 2600 sat glowing under the store lights. In 1981, that wasn't just a toy. It was a television screen, 2 controllers, and an entirely different kind of entertainment than anything most 6-year-olds had access to at home. A cluster of boys had already gathered around it, taking turns. Adam's whole face lit up. Reve made the calculation almost any reasonable parent in that exact setting would have made. She looked around. Security guards patrolling the floor, staff at nearly every counter, dozens of other shoppers in view, a police station directly across the street, visible through the store's own windows. It was noon. It was broad daylight, inside one of the most publicly monitored spaces imaginable. She told Adam she'd be right over in the lamp section. He said, "Okay, Mommy," turned back to the screen, and she walked away. The lamp wasn't in stock. The saleswoman who could help her was out to lunch. Reve left her name and number and headed back toward the toy department. 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most since she'd left him there. Every boy who'd been standing at that Atari display was gone. The screen sat dark. Reve called Adam's name. She walked every aisle. She checked anywhere a 6-year-old might have wandered off to on his own. Nothing. She went to customer service, and the first store announcement went out over the intercom. Then a second, then a third. With each one, the mood around her shifted, because everyone nearby was beginning to understand what she already knew somewhere underneath the part of her mind, still trying not to accept it. Adam wasn't in that store anymore. Here's what Reve did not know while she stood in those aisles, calling her son's name, and what Sears itself chose not to tell her, not to tell the responding officers, and not to tell investigators, for the next 27 years. About 12 minutes after Reve had walked toward the lamp section, an argument broke out at the Atari display, 4 boys disputing whose turn it was. A 17-year-old part-time security employee was called over to handle it. She wasn't trained for this kind of situation, and she made a fast decision under pressure. She split the boys into 2 groups and sent them out through 2 different doors. 2 boys went out the north entrance, the same door Adam and his mother had come in through, the side where their car was parked. 2 others, including Adam, were sent out an east exit, a door that led to a completely different section of the parking lot, one Adam had never seen before. When the employee asked the younger of those 2 boys whether his mother was inside the store, he said nothing. He was 6 years old, dressed in green shorts and a red and white striped shirt, and almost certainly convinced, in that moment, that he was in some kind of trouble. His shyness, the same quiet, genuine shyness that had never once been a problem before, meant he simply followed the older boy out the door without a word, into a parking lot with no landmark he recognized and no way back to where his mother actually was. About 30 minutes later, that same employee heard Adam's name paged over the store intercom, and by every account that's since come to light, Sears said nothing about what she'd witnessed, not to Reve that day, not to the responding police officers, not to the Walsh family for decades afterward. The reasoning, as it eventually came out, traced back to fear of legal liability. That silence, chosen deliberately to protect a company from a lawsuit, held for the better part of 3 decades. By 1:55 that afternoon, nearly 2 hours after Adam had last been seen, Hollywood police were finally called in. The station sat less than 50 feet across the street, visible through the store's own windows. It still took roughly 45 minutes for a uniformed officer to actually arrive. When John Walsh reached the scene, having driven the entire way from his office in Miami, the first officer on scene reportedly told him to slow down, that most kids just wander off and walk home on their own. John's response was direct. This was a 6-year-old who lived 5 miles away and had never once walked anywhere by himself in his life. He asked for a detective. He asked for a supervisor. The next morning, a local paper ran a quote from a police aide suggesting kidnapping wasn't suspected, that the boy was probably just lost, as though a 6-year-old could reasonably navigate 5 miles of South Florida highway in July heat on his own. The department handling this case was a small suburban force, and the limits of their experience showed in almost every decision made during those first critical days. John and a business partner moved into the police station itself and didn't leave for 2 weeks, setting up their own phone line in case a ransom call came in. Reve sat through sleepless nights at that same station, unable to stop thinking about small, specific things, his flip-flops, whether his feet were tired, whether he was cold in just a t-shirt. They distributed 500,000 flyers. The reward climbed from $5,000 to $10,000 to $100,000, eventually reaching $120,000, worth well over $250,000 today. Helicopters searched from the air. Volunteers walked fields on foot. Truck drivers relayed sightings over CB radio. Here's the institutional reality underneath all of that effort, one that's easy to forget from this distance. In 1981, there was no Amber Alert system. No National Center for Missing Children existed yet. The FBI was legally barred from getting involved unless there was clear evidence a state line had been crossed or an actual ransom note had been received. Missing children weren't even entered into the FBI's National Crime Database at that point. When John pressed a coroner about why that gap existed, the coroner, by his own account, didn't know what that database was. John's response, later recounted publicly, was blunt. The country had put a man on the moon, and he was being told he'd have to personally call every coroner in the state of Florida just to find out if his own son was among the unidentified dead. By the seventh day, national media attention had already started drifting toward other stories. John and Reve had secured a spot on a national morning show scheduled for August 11th to make a direct, public plea for Adam's return. The night before that broadcast, two fishermen were casting lines near a drainage canal off the Florida Turnpike, more than 100 miles north of Hollywood. Near nightfall, they noticed something floating in the water. At first, they thought it might be a doll's head. It wasn't. The next morning, while John and Reve were live on national television, still pleading for their son's safe return, investigators over 100 miles away were already working to confirm an identification. That confirmation ultimately came through 4 separate methods: dental records, a visual identification from a close family friend who recognized a specific gap in Adam's front teeth, findings from the medical examiner, and, years later, mitochondrial DNA testing that matched Reve directly. The autopsy findings were delivered with the same clinical precision any medical examiner would use. Adam had sustained blows to the back of the skull from a bladed weapon roughly 5.5 inches long. Cause of death was ruled asphyxiation, combined with blunt trauma. Based on the state of decomposition, Adam had died within 1 to 2 days of being taken. He hadn't been kept alive for any extended period. There had never been a window in which finding him faster would have changed the outcome. The Walsh family held a funeral with an empty casket. The recovered remains were still evidence, not yet releasable. John and Reve stood over a box containing nothing at all and buried their son in name only. Let's pause here for a second. If the level of detail in this story is what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit subscribe now and drop a like, because what happened with the investigation itself from this point forward is, by almost any honest accounting, one of the most mishandled cases in American criminal justice history. When a child is murdered, investigative statistics point in one direction far more often than any other, towards someone close to the family. So that's where Hollywood police started. John and Reve both submitted to polygraph exams. Both passed, with no deception indicated. Then came James Campbell, the family friend who'd been living on and off with the Walshes for years, who'd had breakfast with Reve and Adam that very morning, and who, investigators soon discovered, had been carrying on a 3-year affair with Reve. His first polygraph came back inconclusive. He was visibly shaken during questioning. His second polygraph showed no deception. He underwent hypnosis as part of the process and was eventually cleared entirely. The Walsh family never believed Campbell had any involvement in Adam's death. Hollywood police, though, latched onto that love triangle theory with an intensity that consumed weeks, then months, of investigative time. One officer later admitted, in plain terms, that they'd violated Campbell's civil rights in the process, that they'd done everything short of physically beating him to get a confession that was never going to come, because he hadn't done it. In July of 1983, 2 days before the statute of limitations would have expired, John and Reve filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Sears, alleging negligence, that the store knew its toy department attracted predatory attention, that the video game display effectively functioned as bait, and that the employee's decision to eject Adam through an unfamiliar exit without ever locating his mother amounted to negligence on the company's part. Sears responded by arguing Reve herself had been negligent for leaving Adam unattended, and threatened to drag every private detail of the Walsh's lives into open court. The affair, the family's personal history, all of it, while also subpoenaing active police files, risking the exposure of investigative material that could have compromised any future criminal prosecution entirely. Facing that, the Walshes made the difficult call to drop the lawsuit. They had a larger fight ahead of them, and they chose to spend their energy there instead. Over the following years, dozens of names moved through this investigation. Most were eliminated quickly. 3 are worth understanding in detail, because each one represents a different kind of failure in how this case was handled. The first was a man named Edward Harold James, arrested in 1981 for abducting a child in a nearby Florida city. A cellmate later claimed James had confessed to Adam's murder, describing luring the boy with ice cream. Investigators searched his vehicle, tested for blood evidence, and found nothing conclusive. His employer confirmed he'd been at work the day Adam disappeared. He passed a voice stress test and was cleared. The second was a man named Keith Allen Warren, who'd been arrested years later for attempting to attack someone with a machete in Las Vegas. While incarcerated, he bragged to other inmates about Adam Walsh and voluntarily provided a DNA sample in 2008. That sample ruled him out. He later admitted he'd only made the claim to build a dangerous reputation inside prison. He had no actual connection to the case at all. The third is Jeffrey Dahmer. When Dahmer was arrested in Milwaukee in 1991 and the scale of his crimes became public, people who'd lived in Hollywood, Florida in the summer of 1981 began coming forward. Dahmer had been discharged from the Army that March, flown to Miami instead of returning home, and by July was broke, sleeping on beaches, before eventually finding work at a sandwich shop that operated delivery via a blue van. 7 separate witnesses, shown photographs of both Dahmer and the man police had already been focused on, identified Dahmer, not the other suspect, as the person they recalled seeing at or near the Sears store that day. 7 people, not 1 or 2 isolated accounts. 7, independently, pointing to the same face. Dahmer denied any involvement, telling investigators directly that if he'd done it, he would have said so, that he'd have welcomed the death penalty rather than deny a crime he'd actually committed. And there's a real tension underneath that denial, worth sitting with honestly. Dahmer confessed, in extensive, disturbing detail, to every one of his other known murders. He described each victim, each method, with a level of precision that suggested a man who felt little need to hide anything by that point. So why deny this one specifically? At the same time, Dahmer had also demonstrated, repeatedly, that he was capable of sustained, deliberate deception with his own father, with his attorney, with investigators, across other parts of his life. He left Florida less than a month after Adam disappeared. He was never charged in this case. The question was never definitively resolved. It was simply outlived by other developments in the investigation. In October of 1983, a television movie based on Adam's story aired nationally, watched by an estimated 38 million people. At the end of the broadcast, photographs of other missing children were shown on screen, along with a hotline number. The next morning, a detective in a different Florida county received a phone call. The man on the other end of that call was the same individual 7 witnesses had already pointed to over Dahmer, back when they were shown both photographs side by side. His name was Ottis Toole, a drifter with a long history of arson, already on death row in a Florida prison for an unrelated murder, serving 5 separate life sentences by the time he first confessed to killing Adam. Toole, along with a man named Henry Lee Lucas, had built a disturbing reputation across law enforcement circles nationally. The two had been partners, in crime and in a personal relationship, and together claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders across more than a dozen states. Investigators who worked with them at the time came to call them confession killers, men who would admit to crimes they hadn't actually committed, often in exchange for small favors like better meals or supervised trips outside their cells. Toole's first confession to Adam's murder had immediate, serious problems. He described Adam wearing blue jeans and a blue shirt. Adam had actually been wearing green shorts and a red and white striped shirt that day. He named Lucas as his accomplice, but Lucas turned out to have been sitting in a Maryland jail cell on July 27, 1981, physically incapable of having been anywhere near Florida that day. When confronted with that contradiction, Toole changed his account, claiming he'd acted alone and had only named Lucas out of habit. But there were also details Toole got right, details that hadn't been made public at the time he offered them. The number of blows described in his account matched the autopsy findings exactly. His description of the body's positioning matched what investigators had actually found. He described driving north along the Florida Turnpike and referenced a specific wooden footbridge near the exact mile marker where Adam's remains were eventually located, a detail with no public record anyone could have simply repeated back. His own personal timeline placed him, unaccountably, in South Florida during the precise window Adam disappeared, arriving in the region after his mother's death that May, and effectively unlocated for several days, spanning the exact dates in question. Investigators eventually tracked down the specific vehicle Toole claimed to have used, a 1971 Cadillac that had been repossessed from him by its actual owner after he stopped making payments. Officers treated the car's interior with luminol, a chemical that reacts to trace blood. Both the front and rear floorboards lit up extensively. Crime scene investigators photographed the vehicle's interior in detail, 98 separate photographs. In one image, taken of the carpet fibers directly behind the driver's seat, something appeared in the luminol pattern that looked, to those who eventually examined it, like the outline of a small child's face pressed into the material. Those 98 photographs were never developed. They sat, unprocessed, in an evidence locker for the next 25 years. The carpet itself had been cut out of the vehicle, tagged as evidence, and placed in storage in a different city, awaiting formal collection by Hollywood police. That collection never happened. The Cadillac itself was eventually sold for scrap in 1985. The one piece of physical evidence that could have produced a conclusive DNA match, closing this case beyond any argument, was never lost through theft or fire or any dramatic event. It was simply left behind, sitting in a storage facility, forgotten. Meanwhile, the machete Toole described using, which had also shown trace blood evidence, had its own forensic value degraded past the point of usefulness during the original testing process, a second, separate loss layered on top of the first. One investigator who eventually reviewed that long unprocessed luminol photograph said he believed he could make out the outline of a child's face in the blood pattern on that floorboard. Reve has said publicly that she believes it's her son. She's also been clear that certainty like that can never be fully proven now. The evidence that could have settled it is simply gone. Toole's pattern over the following years became familiar. Confess, recant, confess again, recant again. Across more than a decade, he gave more than 24 separate documented confessions to Adam's murder, each with small variations, each retraction later explained away, depending on who you ask, as either a bid for attention or an attempt to undermine Lucas. On September 15, 1996, Ottis Toole died in that same Florida prison from complications related to cirrhosis and AIDS. He was 49 years old. Before his death, his niece visited him twice in his final months and asked him directly whether he'd killed Adam Walsh. According to her account, he said yes, that he'd always felt bad about it. It was, by every account, a deathbed statement with nothing left for him to gain from it, and no jury left to perform for. John Walsh later said Hollywood police weren't even aware Toole was dying at the time. Nobody from the department went to speak with him before he passed. In 2008, John and Reve hired a retired detective, Joe Matthews, and asked him to do something no single investigator ever had: read the entire case file from beginning to end, all 10,000 pages, every report, every interview, every abandoned lead. Matthews concluded that Toole had in fact killed Adam. Hollywood police reviewed his findings independently and agreed. On December 16, 2008, the department's chief stood at a podium with Adam's parents in the room and formally announced the case was closed. He also issued a public apology for the lost evidence, for the wasted years, for mistakes that, had they not been made, might have put Toole in front of an actual jury before he died. John Walsh, standing there, said that day marked a reaffirmation that Adam hadn't died for nothing, that after 27 years of asking who could have done this to a 6-year-old boy, they finally had an answer. But here's what's also true, and worth stating plainly. There was no new evidence presented that day. No DNA confirmation, no trial. Toole had already been dead for 12 years by the time that announcement was made. What happened in that press conference was a formal re-examination of documents already sitting in a file, followed by an institutional declaration of satisfaction with the conclusion those documents supported. The Walsh family received a public apology. They never received a courtroom verdict. Nobody was ever convicted for what happened to their son. The case is officially closed. Whether it's actually solved, in the fullest sense of that word, is something people who've read the entire file still sometimes disagree on. Some investigators, even now, believe the physical evidence pointed more convincingly toward Dahmer than toward Toole. The photographs that sat undeveloped for 25 years have finally been seen. The carpet that might have answered the question conclusively is gone. The uncertainty was never actually resolved. It was simply declared over. 4 days after Adam's funeral, while the case was still fully open, while nobody had been charged, while the investigation itself was already starting to fracture into competing theories, John and Reve founded an outreach center focused specifically on missing children. Not months later, once the grief had settled into something more manageable. 4 days after standing over an empty casket, in 1982, the Missing Children's Act was signed into law, and for the first time in the country's history, missing children began being entered into the FBI's National Crime Database, closing the exact gap John had once confronted a confused coroner about. In 1984, 3 years after Adam disappeared, John co-founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, with Reve working alongside him the entire way, having stepped away from her own education to help build it from nothing. In 1988, 7 years after that Tuesday afternoon in Sears, John became the host of America's Most Wanted, not immediately, but only after 7 years of advocacy work in hearing rooms, corridors, and television studios before that kind of platform even existed for him to use. The show ran for 23 years, and by its end, had reportedly assisted in the capture of more than 1,000 fugitives, including several individuals who'd appeared on the FBI's own Most Wanted list. In 1994, major retailers across the country implemented what's now widely known as a Code Adam protocol. When a child is reported missing inside a store, the entire building goes into a coordinated lockdown. Every employee mobilizes, and no one is permitted to leave until the child is found. It's named directly for a 6-year-old who once walked out an exit he'd never used before and never made it home. In 2006, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act was signed into federal law, expanding the National Sex Offender Registry, establishing a formal child abuse registry, and strengthening federal penalties for crimes against children nationwide. To date, the organization Adam's parents built has helped in the recovery of several 100,000 missing children. He was 6 years old. He was shy. He called his mother Mommy and his father Daddy. He watched Sesame Street on Saturday mornings. He loved baseball, and he loved drawing. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in July, he stood in line for a video game, looked up at his mother, and told her okay, because everything was fine. It was one of the most public, most closely monitored buildings in the entire area, a police station visible right through the window, and none of that ended up mattering at all. Everything that came afterward, every piece of legislation, every recovered child, every fugitive eventually caught because of a television show that never would have existed otherwise, traces back to that single afternoon and to two parents who turned unimaginable loss into a body of work that's still protecting children who will never know their names. If this case stayed with you the way it stayed with an entire country for over 40 years, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like before you go. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story hit you hardest. Because for a case that technically closed in 2008, there are still questions inside this file that nobody has ever been able to fully put to rest.